On the sweltering July days of 1187, when only the shimmering heat above the cicadas ruled among the Galilean hills, Christianity's greatest catastrophe was preparing. Below the twin peaks of the Horns of Hattin, at the foot of an extinct volcano, the entire dream of the Crusader kingdoms collapsed in a single day. Here, in the shadow of a blazing sun, Saladin, that man-testing Kurdish leader who dedicated his entire life to reclaiming the Holy Land, not only won a battle but changed the course of history. The story, however, begins much earlier, with a man about whom contemporary Arab chroniclers wrote, "Never was a second Saladin born." Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub was born around 1137 in present-day Iraq, in Tikrit, to a noble Kurdish family. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was the city's governor, but the family soon moved to Damascus to enter the service of the mighty Emir Nur ad-Din. The young Saladin was initially not a man of war. Early Arab sources paint a surprising picture of him. They write of a quiet, contemplative youth who preferred religious studies to swordsmanship. Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, Saladin's personal biographer, remembered him thus. In his youth, Saladin was drawn to wisdom and learning. He knew the Quran by heart and often debated with scholars on the finest points of religion. But fate decreed otherwise. In 1164, when he was only 27 years old, Saladin joined his uncle, General Shirkuh, on an Egyptian campaign. This decision changed not only his life, but the entire history of the Middle East. In Egypt, in the ancient land of the pharaohs, Saladin not only became a general, but also learned the most dangerous games of politics. In 1169, at barely 31 years old, Saladin became Egypt's vizier. But this was only the beginning. In the following years, through a series of brilliant political and military moves, he gradually united Egypt and Syria under his rule. The man who once preferred peaceful studies had now become one of the most formidable leaders of the Muslim world. But why was this unification so important? The Crusader kingdoms had made a grave mistake. They believed the Muslim world would remain forever divided. Saladin, however, proved them wrong. When by the end of the 1170s he had extended his rule from Damascus to Cairo, the Crusaders found themselves facing an increasingly strong and unified enemy. Saladin became not only a military, but also a religious leader. He revived the idea of jihad, the holy war, which Arab sources documented thus. Saladin saw that Allah had purified his heart of all worldly desires and set himself a single goal, the liberation of the Holy Land from the infidels. This was not mere propaganda. Saladin was truly a deeply religious man who took the commandments of the Muslim faith seriously. In contrast, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had fallen into serious internal crises by the mid-1180s. It was plagued by dynastic problems similar to those known in Hungary during the final days of the Arpad dynasty. The leprous King Baldwin IV died in 1185, followed by the child Baldwin V, who also died after a year. The throne eventually went to Queen Sibylla, who married Guy de Lusignan, a man of whom even his own court said, "He possesses neither courage nor wisdom." Guy de Lusignan's kingship was disputed from the beginning. Count Raymond of Tripoli, who had previously ruled the country as regent, was openly hostile toward him. The court split into two camps, Guy's supporters and Raymond's backers. This division proved fatal when Saladin prepared to attack. The spark of crisis ignited in the winter of 1186. Reynald de Chatillon, Lord of Kerak, and an extremely quarrelsome and cruel knight, attacked a Muslim pilgrim caravan, even though a peace treaty was in effect between the Crusaders and Saladin. This attack was not mere robbery. It was the excuse Saladin had been waiting for. Arab sources describe Saladin's indignation in detail. When he received news of the atrocities committed against the pilgrims, Saladin swore before Allah that he would kill Reynald de Chatillon with his own hands. Nothing could stop him from this oath. And indeed, Saladin never forgot this oath. At the end of 1186 and the beginning of 1187, Saladin began preparing for war. He summoned troops from throughout his empire: Egyptian Mamluk knights, Syrian heavy cavalry, Kurdish mountaineers, and Arab Bedouins. According to Arab historians, An army of 40,000 gathered on the Golan Heights, one of the largest Muslim armies of the Crusader era. But Saladin launched not only military, but also psychological warfare. With smaller units, he began raiding the territory of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, aiming to force King Guy to come out of his fortified positions and be compelled to open battle. The first act of the trap took place in May 1187 at the Battle of Crescent Springs. Gerard de Rochefort, Grand Master of the Templar Order, with an insanity bordering on recklessness, attacked one of Saladin's units, even though the enemy forces outnumbered his many times over. The result was catastrophic. 140 Templar knights and 300 foot soldiers died, and Gerard de Rochefort managed to escape with only a few companions. This battle clearly showed that the Crusader military elite was beginning to weaken, but King Guy and his advisors did not draw the appropriate conclusions. Moreover, Gerard de Rochefort remained one of the most influential voices at court. At the end of June 1187, Saladin crossed the Jordan River. His target was the city of Tiberias, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, where Countess Esquiva, wife of Count Raymond of Tripoli, was staying. This move was exactly what Saladin had counted on. King Guy had to decide whether to go to Tiberias's aid or remain safe in his camp at Safaria. The decision dragged on for weeks. Count Raymond of Tripoli, a veteran of war, firmly opposed the relief mission. His argument was logical. Saladin cannot maintain the siege of Tiberias for long. His army is too large. Supply problems will soon force him to withdraw. We, however, are safe here in Safaria, with access to water and supplies. But Gerard de Rochefort and the war party held different views. The Templar Grand Master accused, "It was Raymond's treachery that lost us the Battle of Crescent Springs. Now he wants to talk us into cowardice to save his own skin." King Guy, who was a weak character, couldn't decide whom to believe. Finally, on July 3rd, on a hot and humid night, King Guy made the fatal decision. He would march out from Safuria to relieve Tiberias. According to Arab sources, this decision surprised the entire Crusader camp. Many believed the king had finally resolved on brave action, but those experienced in desert warfare set out filled with fears. The Crusader army that set out was an imposing sight. Nearly 20,000 men, 1,200 heavy cavalry knights, 15 to 18,000 foot soldiers, countless wagons and pack animals. At the head rode King Guy himself. Beside him, the relic of the True Cross, carried by the Bishop of Acre. The army's weaponry was at the most modern level of the time. Shining armor made by the most skilled armorers, long swords from Milan and Toledo, and hundreds of bows and crossbows. But already on the first day it became clear that this campaign would end in catastrophe. As soon as the column left the safe shadows of Safuria and struck out toward the open Galilean hills, Saladin's light cavalry immediately began harassment. If you enjoyed this story from the world of the greatest medieval battles, then subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Many more exciting stories await us from the world of the Crusades, and you mustn't miss a single moment. The Muslim fighting style was completely different from what the Crusaders were accustomed to. The heavy armored European knights relied on concentrated, decisive charges, but Saladin's soldiers applied entirely different tactics. The Kurdish and Arab light cavalry constantly surrounded the Crusader column, shooting arrows from a distance, then disappearing with lightning speed before the Crusaders could strike back. The Arab archers applied extremely disciplined and effective tactics. They didn't try to kill individual knights. This was almost impossible through heavy armor, but targeted the horses. When a warrior's horse fell, the knight became practically defenseless in the desert heat in his heavy armor. But Saladin's most dangerous weapon was nature itself. The Arab leader knew precisely that the Crusader army's weakest point would be water shortage. Therefore, his troops took control of every spring and well along the route, and when they couldn't do this, they muddied or poisoned the water. The Crusader column was already in serious trouble by the evening of the first day. The knights, riding in 30 to 40 kilogram armor under the blazing sun, desperately sought water. Many of the foot soldiers had already fainted from the heat, and more soldiers left the ranks to find shade and refreshing drink somewhere. King Guy and his advisors made another fatal mistake in this critical situation. Instead of turning back and returning to Safuria, they decided to continue the advance. Their calculation was that if they reached the Sea of Galilee, they would find sufficient water there and could resume fighting against Saladin. The night of July 4th was horrible for the Crusader camp. The soldiers were tormented not only by thirst and fatigue, but also by Saladin's psychological warfare. The Arab troops lit fires around the camp and all night made shouts that terrified the Crusader soldiers. The Arab historian Ibn al-Athir described this night thus: "The Christians lay on the ground like dead animals. Their tongues hung from their mouths with thirst, and their eyes rolled in blood. Saladin's soldiers danced around them and shouted the name of Allah." When the sun rose on the morning of July 4th, the Crusader army was already incapable of organized fighting. Many of the knights couldn't put on their armor, and the foot soldiers were leaving the ranks en masse to search for water somewhere. King Guy desperately tried to prepare his army for battle in this hopeless situation, but it was already too late. Saladin's troops surrounded them at the twin-peaked Horns of Hattin and could begin the final attack. The battle began in the morning hours. This time, Saladin chose not the usual harassment, but launched a coordinated, powerful attack. According to Arab sources, 40,000 Muslim soldiers attacked the Crusader position simultaneously, while the Crusader numbers barely exceeded 15,000. In the first phase of the battle, it still seemed that the Crusader heavy cavalry could resist. Count Raymond of Tripoli personally led the 200-man charge that nearly broke through Saladin's lines. The Count and a few companions actually managed to break through the enemy ranks, but when they looked back, they saw that no one had been able to follow them. Galilean of Ibelin, who also survived the battle, later recalled this moment thus: "When Count Raymond broke through the enemy, for a moment we thought we might still escape. But then we saw that behind us, the camp was in flames, and Muslim banners were flying around the king's tent." Saladin had applied a brilliant maneuver. His troops set fire to the dry grass and bushes around the Crusader camp. The smoke and flames not only physically tormented the Crusaders, but also psychologically destroyed their morale. The decisive moment of the battle came when the Crusader infantry finally collapsed completely. The soldiers, exhausted by thirst and fatigue, could no longer resist and surrendered en masse or fled from the battlefield. King Guy's last refuge was a small hill near the peaks of Hattin. Here, around the relic of the True Cross, a few dozen knights and a few hundred-foot soldiers still gathered. But resistance was hopeless. Saladin personally led the final charge. According to Arab sources, the Sultan himself fought and came so close to King Guy that he could have personally taken him prisoner. But the Kurdish leader wisely withdrew and left this honor to his soldiers. By the end of the battle, barely 3,000 men from the Crusader army escaped. Of the 20,000-strong army, only 40 to 50 knights managed to flee, including Count Raymond of Tripoli and Galilean of Ibelin. The rest of the knights, including King Guy himself, fell into Saladin's captivity. But the battle's true significance lay not in the military losses, but in the spoils that Saladin acquired. The capture of the relic of the True Cross was such a blow to the Christian world that modern people cannot even imagine it. This relic was the holiest symbol of Christian faith in the Holy Land, and its loss caused an enormous moral and religious crisis in Europe. Saladin's soldiers divided the prisoners among themselves. The ordinary knights paid ransom, but members of the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, were executed on Saladin's orders. Only Gerard de Riedfort, the Templar Grand Master, remained alive, probably saving his life by betraying important secrets to Saladin. The most dramatic scene, however, occurred when the fate of King Guy and Reynald de Chatillon was decided. Arab sources describe in detail how Reynald's execution took place in Saladin's tent. Saladin received the two most important prisoners. He offered water to King Guy, a sign of Eastern hospitality. But when Reynald also wanted to drink from the same cup, Saladin held him back. "I did not give him water," he said in Arabic, which meant he was not under protection. Then Saladin reproached Reynald for breaking his oath. "How many times have you been able to make an oath and break it? How many times have you signed peace treaties only to violate them?" Reynald's response was arrogant and defiant. Kings always act thus. I have done nothing special. At this, Saladin stood up, drew his sword, and beheaded Reynald de Chatillon with a single blow. King Guy, seeing what happened, fearfully awaited his own fate, but Saladin reassured him, "A king does not kill kings." But this man went beyond all bounds. News of the Battle of Hattin spread with lightning speed throughout the then-known world. In Europe, the news caused such shock that Pope Urban III allegedly died from the devastating news. The new pope, Gregory VIII, even before the fall of Jerusalem, issued the Audita Tremendi bull, calling for a new crusade. But the catastrophe was not yet over. According to Saladin's brilliant strategy, after the victory at Hattin, he immediately set about capturing the fortresses and cities of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And since barely any Crusader military force remained in the entire Holy Land after the battle, cities and castles surrendered one after another. Acre capitulated on July 8th, and Haifa, Caesarea, Arsuf, Jaffa, Ramla, and Ascalon fell within a few weeks. Saladin's tactic was simple and effective. He offered every castle and city that if they surrendered without resistance, the inhabitants would remain alive and could leave with their portable possessions. If they resisted, they would lose everything. Knowing the medieval laws of war, this was a generous offer. According to contemporary laws, if a castle or city resisted siege, the victor was entitled to complete destruction, the slaughter of men, the enslavement of women and children, and the robbery of all property. By mid-September, Saladin controlled virtually the entire Kingdom of Jerusalem. Only two places remained in Christian hands: the port city of Tyre and Jerusalem itself. Tyre was able to resist because Conrad of Montferrat had arrived there by ship and established an excellent defensive position. But Jerusalem's situation was hopeless. On September 20th, Saladin's armies appeared beneath the walls of Jerusalem. The defense of the holy city fell to Balian of Ibelin, who was one of the few nobles who survived Hattin. But the situation he found himself facing was almost hopeless. The city was full of refugees from Saladin's conquests. Estimates suggest that nearly 40,000 people were crowded into the city, but among them were barely 14 trained knights. Balian was forced to create new knights from squires and citizens, but this, of course, could not replace the lack of professional military force. From the treasury in the city, Balian could take money to organize the defense, because there was kept the foundation money of King Henry II of England. This enabled him to buy food and weapons, but he couldn't hire soldiers. Saladin was a thorough man. First, he circled Jerusalem to find the weakest point in the walls. Then he launched his attack against the northern and western walls of the city, precisely where, almost 90 years earlier, the troops of the First Crusade had broken into the city. The first days of the siege actually favored the Christians. Balian organized the defense surprisingly well, and all the Muslim assaults were repelled. A contemporary Latin source describes the first week of the siege thus: "The city's inhabitants fought bravely for a full week, while the enemy encamped opposite David's tower. Saladin saw that he was making no progress, and that with his present method he could do no harm to the city." But Saladin did not give up either. On September 26th, he executed a brilliant move. At night, he moved his camp to the eastern side of the city, to the Jehoshaphat Valley and the area of the Mount of Olives. This movement completely changed the dynamics of the siege. The eastern wall was much weaker than the northern one. Moreover, here Saladin could set up siege engines without the city's defenders seriously disturbing him. The second decisive advantage was that on the eastern side, he could apply the technique of undermining. The miners, engineers and miners, began undermining the foundation of the city wall. This technique worked by digging a tunnel under the wall, then reinforcing it with wooden supports. Finally, when the undermining was complete, they set fire to the wooden supports beneath, causing the wall to collapse. By October 1st, Saladin's miners had made such a large breach in the wall that it became visible to the city's defenders. Baron Balian knew this marked the beginning of the end. Within a day or two, the enemy could penetrate the city, and then massacre would be inevitable. The decisive day was October 2nd. Baron Balian was aware that militarily he could no longer hold the city, but he could make one last desperate diplomatic attempt: go out to negotiate with Saladin. During the negotiations, Balian delivered a shocking ultimatum to Saladin, which is also preserved in Arab sources. If you do not give humane terms for the city's surrender, then we will slaughter every Muslim prisoner. There are 5,000, demolish the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, burn all the city's treasures, and fight to the last man. Then you won't be able to acquire anything intact either. This threat truly shocked Saladin. The Sultan, who was a deeply religious man, could not allow Islam's holiest sites to be harmed. Therefore, he was willing to enter negotiations. The agreement they finally made was extremely detailed. Every Christian man could pay 10 dinars for his freedom, every woman 5, every child 2. Those who couldn't pay the ransom would be taken into slavery. However, Balian pointed out that there were 40,000 people in the city, and 20,000 of them could never raise the ransom. Saladin finally agreed to a generous compromise. For 30,000 dinars, he would free 7,000 poor Christians. On October 9th, Saladin ceremonially entered Jerusalem. This moment was as symbolically important to him as it was militarily. After 98 years, a Muslim ruler again governed Islam's third holiest city. But Saladin's behavior upon conquering Jerusalem stood in sharp contrast to how the troops of the crusading armies had behaved in 1099. When the armies of the First Crusade captured the city, they conducted a terrible massacre. Estimates suggest they killed tens of thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Saladin, however, explicitly ordered that no one be harmed. The Christian inhabitants could safely leave the city and take their possessions with them. He even left the Church of the Holy Sepulchre untouched, though his followers would not have wanted this. This magnanimity naturally did not stem from pure humanitarian considerations. Saladin's political calculation was that if he treated Jerusalem's inhabitants mercifully, then other Christian cities would surrender more easily. And indeed, this tactic proved successful. However, Saladin pursued not only military and political, but also religious goals. He immediately ordered that the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque be cleansed and reconsecrated. The Christian cross was removed from the top of the Dome of the Rock, and the symbol of the crescent was placed there instead. But what was even more important, Saladin had the mosques sprinkled with rose water to cleanse them of Christian impurity. Arab chroniclers describe these ceremonies in detail. Ibn al-Athir writes, "When Saladin entered the Dome of the Rock, he fell to his knees and prayed at length to express his gratitude to Allah. Scholars and religious leaders gathered around him, and together they sang the Lord's glory. This was the first time in almost 90 years that the voice of the true faith echoed within these sacred walls." But Saladin's most important decision was not to demolish any Christian temple. He left the Church of the Holy Sepulchre untouched, and even promised that Christian pilgrims could continue to visit it for a fee. This was a decision that many of his own followers did not understand. According to contemporary Muslim sources, several of Saladin's advisors urged him to demolish the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Their argument was that this would prevent Christians from preparing new crusades. But Saladin's wisdom truly showed itself here. "If I demolish this temple," he explained to his advisors, "then the Christians will never accept their defeat. They will always strive to return and rebuild it. But if we leave it intact and allow them to come here as pilgrims, then they will gradually resign themselves to the fact that this is no longer their country." This decision was truly brilliant. Saladin simultaneously showed his religious tolerance and political wisdom. Christian Europe could not portray him as a barbarian conqueror because he behaved too humanely. After the fall of Jerusalem, Saladin continued his campaign. In November, several Crusader castles and cities still remained to be captured. The most important among them were the castles of Crac des Chevaliers, Quérac, and Montreal, all legendary fortresses that the Crusaders had built over decades. But for the defenders of these castles too, it was clear that their resistance was hopeless. After the Battle of Hattin, barely any Crusader soldiers remained in the entire Holy Land, and help from Europe could not arrive for years. Therefore, the castles surrendered one after another. The most dramatic moment came during the surrender of Kerak Castle. This was Raynald de Chatillon's castle, the place from which he had launched the fatal attack on the Muslim caravan. Saladin personally led the troops besieging the castle, and when the captain surrendered, the Sultan said to him, "This castle has caused much suffering to the true believers. But I am not such a man as your former lords. Whoever surrenders in peace will suffer no harm." And indeed, he freed the castle's defenders. By the end of 1187, Saladin's rule extended over virtually the entire former kingdom of Jerusalem. Only the port city of Tyre remained in Christian hands, and a few small castles in the desert. The Crusaders' 200-year presence in the Holy Land was almost completely destroyed. But Saladin's victory had much greater significance than a military success. The Battle of Hattin and the conquest of Jerusalem changed the balance of the entire medieval world. Christianity, which had successfully expanded eastward for almost 2 centuries, suddenly stopped and was forced into retreat. In Europe, the news caused such shock that churchmen called it Christianity's greatest catastrophe. Pope Gregory VIII, in the Audita Tremendi bull, wrote thus, "Terrible and horrible news has reached our ears, which fills every Christian heart with mourning. The pagans have devastated God's inheritance and touched the Holy of Holies with their sacrilegious hands." Enormous pressure also fell on European rulers. King Henry III of England immediately introduced a special tax, the so-called Saladin tithe, to raise money for a new crusade. King Philip II of France and Emperor Frederick I of Germany also issued mobilization orders. But preparations for the Third Crusade took years, and meanwhile Saladin continued to strengthen. The Kurdish Sultan used this time to consolidate his rule in the Holy Land and further build his empire. Saladin's personality became truly legendary during this period. Arab sources unanimously write that he lived an extremely simple life. He did not build a palace for himself, and he distributed most of his wealth as alms to the poor. Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who was his personal secretary, wrote of him, "Saladin lived like a dervish in a narrow cloak. He never ate luxuriously and never drank anything but water. He spent all his free time reading the Quran and praying, but when he had to go into battle, he became a lion." This personality also evoked respect in Europe. When the leaders of the Third Crusade, King Richard I of England, King Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick I of Germany, finally set out for the Holy Land in 1189, they no longer wanted to fight an unknown barbarian leader, but an opponent about whom legends circulated in their countries. European troubadours and minnesingers began singing songs about Saladin already during his lifetime. A contemporary French verse went, "There is among the pagans a king, who, though not of Christian faith, is yet so noble and honorable that many Christians could learn chivalrous behavior from him." The Third Crusade lasted from 1189 to 1192, and truly breathtaking clashes occurred. Between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, such a duel took place that became a favorite theme of medieval literature. During the Crusade, the Crusaders succeeded in recapturing Acre and several other port cities, but they could not recapture Jerusalem. The consequences of the Battle of Hattin were too serious to be eliminated in a few years. In 1192, Richard and Saladin made peace. According to the agreement, the Christians could keep the coastal cities from Tyre to Jaffa, but Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Christian pilgrims could freely visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but no longer as citizens of Crusader states, but as Saladin's guests. Saladin died in Damascus in 1193, at only 56 years old. The circumstances of his death were also characteristic of his life. He died so poor that there was barely money for his funeral. He had distributed all his wealth as alms, and not a single dinar remained after him. But his spiritual legacy was eternal. Saladin proved that Crusader conquest was not unstoppable, and that unified Muslim resistance was capable of pushing back Western expansion. The Battle of Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem meant the end of that Crusader era, when it seemed that Christianity would permanently take root in the Holy Land. But perhaps Saladin's greatest impact was that he changed Europeans' image of the Orient. While in the era of the early Crusades, Muslims were still regarded as pagan barbarians, after Saladin, they spoke with respect of noble-hearted Saracen leaders. The medieval worldview, according to which Christianity was the rightful heir to all holy places, could never fully recover after the Battle of Hattin. Saladin showed that there existed another, strong and regulated civilization, capable of matching Christian chivalric ideals, but still following a different religion. If you enjoyed this exciting journey into the world of the most dramatic moments of the Crusades, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, and write a comment about what was the most exciting moment for you. In the next video, we'll talk about the greatest battles of the Third Crusade and Richard the Lionheart's legendary duels with Saladin. See you in the next video, and let's continue discovering great historical adventures together.